He thought it was just another card game, but within minutes the room would be filled with gunfire. If you love stories about power, betrayal, and the dark side of history, make sure to follow, because this one changes everything. New York City, Coney Island, Brooklyn, April 15, 1931, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Inside a small Italian restaurant called Nuova Villa Tammaro, a meeting was about to change the Mafia forever. Giuseppe Masseria, better known as Joe the Boss, sat at a wooden table in the basement dining room. The table was covered with green felt, cards and chips neatly arranged. 2 bodyguards stood near the door. The smell of tobacco and whiskey filled the air. Across from him sat his lieutenant, a young, ambitious gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano. Masseria had built his empire through violence and intimidation. Born in Sicily in 1886, he came to America at 17 and rose through the underworld during Prohibition. By the late 1920s, he ruled one of the most powerful crime families in New York. People called him the man who could dodge bullets. But now, the bullets were catching up. For more than 2 years, New York's mafia had been at war. It was called the Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between Joe Masseria's old-school Sicilian faction and a rival group led by Salvatore Maranzano. Street murders, ambushes, car bombings, both sides losing men by the week. At the restaurant table, Masseria laughed, shuffled his cards, and raised his glass. Luciano smiled politely. Then, without warning, he pushed back his chair. "I'll be right back," he said. "Just going to wash up." He walked toward the back hallway, calm, quiet, leaving Masseria with his guards and the rest of the crew. Moments later, 2 men entered through the side door. Long coats, hats pulled low. They didn't speak. Each carried a pistol, one a .32 Colt, the other a .38 automatic. Luciano reached the restroom door. That was the signal. 5 shots shattered the silence. The first bullet hit Masseria in the back. Then the second. The third struck his head. He slumped forward over the table as cards and chips scattered to the floor. Chairs crashed. Glass shattered. The 2 gunmen fired again, then turned and ran through the kitchen door into the alley. Outside, a black sedan roared to life and disappeared down West 15th Street. When the noise stopped, the restaurant was still. Masseria lay motionless across the table. Blood spread across the green felt. His straw hat had fallen beside him, 2 bullet holes clean through the brim. Police arrived minutes later. Detectives found shell casings on the floor, a deck of cards near the victim's hand, and 2 pistols tossed in the alley. The coroner recorded 5 bullet wounds, head, chest, and back. Death was instant. The bodyguards claimed they hadn't seen the shooters. No one had. The witnesses stayed silent, afraid or paid, no one knew. Reporters rushed to the scene. Flashbulbs popped. Some said Masseria still clutched 4 aces, calling it the dead man's hand. Others said a photographer planted the cards for the shot. Either way, the image hit every front page by morning. For police, the case was simple and unsolvable. Everyone suspected Luciano, but there was no proof. He told detectives he'd been in the bathroom. No one could say otherwise. No arrests, no witnesses. Case open, but going nowhere. Earlier that week, Masseria had tried to hold on to power. He called his men together, demanding loyalty. But his empire was collapsing. Maranzano's soldiers were taking over his bootlegging routes. His own lieutenants were abandoning him, some out of fear, others for opportunity. By the time the shooting stopped, Joe the Boss was already history. That afternoon, the basement of Nuova Villa Tammaro became one of the most infamous crime scenes in New York. A single card game had ended, the reign of the Mafia's first self-declared boss of bosses. When detectives finished their report, it read like a police manual. Victims seated at card table, multiple gunshots fired at close range, offenders escaped in dark sedan. Motive, internal gang dispute. By sundown, the restaurant was closed off with yellow tape. The table remained exactly as it was, overturned, covered in blood, empty glasses untouched. Outside, the streets of Coney Island went on as if nothing had happened. But inside the city's underworld, the message was loud and clear. The old guard had fallen. A new order was on the rise. Joe the Boss Masseria was gone. The Castellammarese War was about to end. And the man who walked away from that table, Lucky Luciano, was just getting started. The morning after Masseria's death, rumors spread through Brooklyn and Manhattan. Newspapers ran headlines calling it the end of an era. Police detectives filled the small restaurant again, documenting the blood-stained table, collecting shells, and questioning every witness they could find. One waitress said she saw a man she didn't recognize paying for lunch at Masseria's table shortly before the shooting. The restaurant owner, Gerardo Scarpato, reportedly told her not to talk about it. The ledger for that day showed a prepaid entry labeled Table 7 Masseria Party. 3 empty whiskey glasses, 2 seafood plates, and a deck of cards remained on the table. The black sedan used by the shooters had been abandoned several miles away with stolen license plates. The wider war, the Castellammarese War, was already in its final phase. It had begun in February 1930, when Masseria ordered the killing of his former ally Gaetano Reina. That single act set off a 2-year blood feud between Sicilian factions in New York. Throughout 1930, Masseria's organization suffered heavy losses. His enforcer Giuseppe Morello was murdered. Gun battles in the Bronx and Brooklyn became routine. Maranzano's faction, organized, disciplined, and better funded, slowly gained control of bootlegging and gambling operations. By early 1931, Masseria's power was fading. Inside his camp, younger men like Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis were losing patience. They saw Masseria's old-world leadership as reckless and outdated. His constant demand for tribute and revenge had turned profitable rackets into chaos. Luciano began secret talks with Maranzano's representatives. He proposed ending the war peacefully by removing Masseria and reorganizing the Mafia into a modern business. Maranzano agreed. On one condition, Luciano had to eliminate his own boss. On April 14, 1931, Luciano arranged lunch for the next afternoon at Nuova Villa Tammaro, the same restaurant Masseria liked for its privacy. Masseria accepted, unaware it was a trap. At 3:02 p.m. the next day, the hit took place. Witness accounts varied, but all agreed on the same sequence. Luciano excused himself. Gunmen entered, and within seconds, Masseria was dead. Police recovered multiple shell casings, 32 and 38 caliber, and matched them to 2 automatic pistols found in the abandoned sedan. In less than 10 seconds, the shooting had ended a war that lasted more than 2 years. After the murder, Maranzano wasted no time. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the underworld under his control. Luciano inherited Masseria's rackets and immediately began reshaping the structure of organized crime. No one was ever charged for Masseria's death. Luciano had an alibi. Witnesses refused to talk. One man believed to be involved, John Silk Stockings Giuseppe, was killed 3 months later. Others, like Bugsy Siegel and Anastasia, quietly left town for a few weeks. On April 20, 1931, Masseria's funeral took place in East Harlem. The procession drew thousands. His casket, covered in flowers, was carried through the streets as onlookers whispered that the Mafia's first great war had ended, but the peace that followed was fragile. Within 5 months, Maranzano himself would be killed in his Manhattan office, betrayed by the same man who helped him win the war, Lucky Luciano. The era of old-world bosses, the Mustache Petes, was over. A new generation, pragmatic, ruthless, and business-minded, now ruled. Luciano, Genovese, Adonis, and Lansky replaced violence with structure. Their goal was national control. In the weeks following Masseria's death, detectives filed their final reports. The case remained officially open but inactive. Evidence was sealed, and the restaurant reopened under new ownership. The table was replaced, but locals said the blood never fully came out of the floorboards. Historians would later call the hit on Joe the Boss the turning point. The moment America's Mafia evolved. From street war to corporate empire, inside police headquarters, detectives compiled statements from bystanders. One cook recalled hearing water running in the back just before the shots. Then came the sound of rapid gunfire. When he entered the dining room, Masseria was face down on the table. The card game had lasted 46 minutes. The gunfire lasted less than 10 seconds. The getaway car drove barely 2 miles before being abandoned. Within days, Luciano met with Maranzano in secret to confirm that the deal was done. Maranzano congratulated him and promised a place at his side. But Luciano was already planning his next move, one that would eliminate the old boss and replace him with a council of equals. By early summer, Masseria's empire was gone. His East Harlem headquarters stood empty. His men either defected or disappeared. Those who survived joined Luciano's restructured families. The new order was already taking shape, 5 families, each autonomous but united under a single code of conduct. The betrayal that killed Joe Masseria did more than end a war. It rewrote the rules of organized crime in America. Within days of the murder, detectives concluded what they already suspected. The hit had been arranged by Lucky Luciano and approved by Salvatore Maranzano. The police questioned Joe Adonis, one of Masseria's former lieutenants, but he said nothing. The official report recorded only 2 words under statement: no comment. On April 17th, detectives named John Silk Stockings Giuseppe as a suspect. His coat had been found near the crime scene, but Giuseppe would never face trial. 3 months later, he was found dead in Brooklyn, shot in the head, execution style. The case file was marked closed without conviction. By September 1931, the power balance in New York had changed again. Maranzano, now the self-declared boss of all bosses, operated from his Park Avenue office surrounded by armed guards. Luciano had become his lieutenant in name only. In truth, he was already building a new plan. On September 10, 1931, 4 men entered Maranzano's office posing as tax agents. Minutes later, the guards were disarmed and Maranzano was stabbed and shot to death. The old order was gone. Luciano was now the undisputed architect of modern organized crime. Meanwhile, the investigation into Masseria's murder remained open but stagnant. Brooklyn Precinct 62 logged the evidence. 2 automatic pistols, 7 spent shell casings, and 1 deck of cards found near the body. The crime scene photographs showed the table overturned, chairs broken, and Masseria's hat lying in a pool of blood. The report noted, victim died instantly, cause multiple gunshot wounds to head, chest, and back. Masseria's body was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Queens. The funeral drew thousands, including both friends and rivals. Among the mourners were men who had already pledged loyalty to Luciano's new regime. On the surface, the ceremony honored the fallen boss. In truth, it marked the beginning of a new criminal government. In the following months, Luciano organized a meeting of key families across the country. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia sent representatives. There would be no more boss of bosses. Instead, each family would govern its own territory, united by a council known simply as the Commission. The system changed everything. Disputes were settled through meetings, not gunfire. Profits were divided through agreements, not ambushes. What began with a card game in a Brooklyn restaurant became the foundation of a national syndicate. At the restaurant, investigators sealed the basement dining room for several weeks. The bullet holes in the walls were patched, but the stains on the floor remained faintly visible. Eventually, the restaurant reopened under a new name. Patrons claimed that on quiet afternoons, the smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. A single civilian witness, a cab driver named George Lombardo, told police he had seen a dark sedan speeding away moments after the gunfire. 2 men in overcoats sat inside. He did not see their faces. His testimony was filed, then forgotten. The case officially closed in early 1932 with no arrests. Historians later described the murder of Joe the Boss as one of the most strategic killings in mafia history. Precise, fast, and symbolic. It demonstrated that power inside the underworld no longer belonged to the loudest man, but to the smartest. By 1932, the new order was firmly in place. Vito Genovese controlled construction and narcotics. Albert Anastasia ran the docks. Joe Adonis oversaw gambling and extortion. Luciano sat at the center, overseeing operations that stretched from New York to Chicago and Los Angeles. Government reports began referring to this structure as the syndicate. Behind every nightclub, racetrack, and shipping contract, there was a trace of the organization born from Masseria's death. The Bureau of Investigation, still years away from becoming the FBI, collected intelligence on the new hierarchy. Agents noted that the murder of Masseria established precedent for leadership transition within organized crime. It became a blueprint for how power would shift quietly in the decades that followed. Inside the restaurant's records, a final entry remained. Dinner for Mr. Masseria and 6 guests, $75.50 paid in cash. The owner refused further questions. By the summer of 1931, newspapers called it the lunch that changed the Mafia. Reporters returned to photograph the site. The bullet holes had been plastered over, but the legend remained. For the younger generation of gangsters, the message was clear. Loyalty had limits, and survival required intelligence. For law enforcement, it was a reminder that the Mafia could evolve faster than the institutions trying to stop it. At the war that began in 1930 with open gunfights ended in 1931 with a handshake and one final volley of bullets. Inside a quiet restaurant, the card game at Nuova Villa Tammaro became part of mob mythology. Books, movies, and historians retold it endlessly. The boss playing cards with friends, one man excusing himself, the sudden eruption of gunfire, and the image of a dead mob king still clutching his cards. Every retelling returned to the same irony, that Joe the Boss had died the way he lived, confident, surrounded by his men, never imagining the betrayal waiting at the table. In the years that followed, Luciano's organization would dominate American crime. But every structure it built, every dollar it earned traced back to that afternoon on Coney Island when an empire ended over a game of cards. The gunmen who carried out the hit were never formally identified. Street rumors named Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel among them. None ever confirmed it. For them, silence was survival. The table itself was eventually removed and sold as scrap. The building later changed ownership several times. Decades later, locals claimed to know exactly where it stood, pointing to the corner of West 15th Street as the place where history shifted. On April 15, 1931, 5 men sat down to play cards. Only one didn't walk out. Within hours, the blood was washed away, but the city would never be the same again.